Happy Mother's Day. We're just doing it all this morning. Welcome. So if you got a Bible, bust that open to Acts chapter 16. Or you can download the Bible app for free, and you can go to Acts chapter 16. Welcome again to those of you at mochurch.tv. Thanks for joining us. Happy Mother's Day. The year was 2009, and I want to make it really clear that up to that point, I had never accidentally walked into a woman's restroom. It was kind of a point of pride for me. I mean, I had many guy friends who were like, oh, it was the worst. You won't believe what I did. What'd you do? And they would describe to me some event that took place. And I would laugh in their faces. It would be like I was sitting in a stall and I looked at the next stall. I was like, those are weird looking shoes. And then they evaluated and were like, oh no. And they realized, that they were in a woman's restroom. And I was like, you are so dumb. Like, I don't even know if there's a dumber person on the face. You made it all the way into the stall? Oh man, this is crazy. And so, man, up to 2009, I was batting 1,000. I was bowling a perfect game. I was pitching a no-no. I had never, ever walked into a women's restroom accidentally and had bragged to my friends about it quite a bit. So I was asked to speak at a convention for Christian youth. It was called the Eastern Christian Convention. And I was there, and they have like the Eastern Christian Convention that's for the adults, like big people church. Then they have the middle school and high schoolers, and they asked if I would come speak to the students, and I love doing that. So I was like, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to come speak for the students at the Eastern Christian Convention in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And so I was pumped about that. Well, there were 3 events going on in this large hotel that was a convention center, and there was 3 events. The ECC for youth, which I was a part of. Then there was also randomly a Christian women's conference going on. And so near my conference, there just weren't a lot of restrooms. And when there were students there. So I was like, during the worship, I was like, I got to speak probably, I'm thinking 15 minutes. I'm going to go use the restroom real quick, come back. So I walk down this empty, desolate, no one is in this hallway, walk way down this wing, passing ballrooms, things like that, get to some restrooms. And like I said, hardly anybody in the hallways at all. And I burst into the restroom, and the atmosphere in that restroom was the exact opposite as it was out in the hall. It was like a party was going on in there. It was packed with women. And I busted in, and I was like, with confidence, man, because I was in a hurry. I'm going to go to the bathroom, and then I'm going to run back, and I'm going to be ready to speak, get mic'd up, and all that stuff. So I bust in. I was like, and all of a sudden, every eye that wasn't in a stall was on me. And I was like, oh, no. And there were women washing their hands, drying their hands. There were women's feet under the stalls that I could see. There were women fellowshipping and standing around talking to each other. There were women watching The Notebook and an iPhone 3. There were women everywhere. And I was like, oh, no, the streak is broken. I was like, oh, and all I could think in my mind was how my guy friends were just going to beat me down for this, because this came up often in our stories. So I froze in my tracks, and I just was like, no, I have desecrated a woman's restroom at a Christian convention. Beth Moore is going to find out about this and blacklist me. It's a Christian speaker for this. Dr. Bernice King is going to get a restraining order on me, another Christian speaker. And so I stood there, and it's like my life flashed in front of my eyes, man. I was just like, my ministry is clearly over. This is going to be a preacher scandal. My marriage might be rocky after this moment. My guy friends are going to destroy me. So the best, most appropriate thing would have been for me to just quickly be like, sorry, ladies, and U-turn and head right out. But I froze. You could have counted to 5 Apple. I just stood there gawking, just stood there and was just frozen in that moment. And so it was super awkward. Like, I almost passed out. I was like, oh my gosh, move, turn around and leave the room, Smith. But then finally a funny thing happened. All of a sudden, as I stood there at about 5 Apple, women started more quickly washing their hands and finishing up and drying their hands more quickly and scurrying around. And people start coming out of stalls. Toilets start flushing. People start coming out of stalls, and they would blast by me, head for the door, and avert eye contact. And on their way, I was like, what in the world? There was one straggler, and it was hysterical because it was like everybody picked up the vibe, but one person hadn't picked up the vibe. They were a little bit longer. So it was like, I'm still frozen, and there's one woman in the stall. And all of a sudden, I hear, whoosh. She gets out, like really short steps, hurrying, washes real quick, gets dry, runs by. And I kid you not, it's like a TV sitcom, one paper towel. As she leaves, like, there it is. And I'm just there as this paper towel falls to the floor. I'm like, what in the world just happened? My heart is beating. I feel like the biggest failure in the world, and I'm just about to pass out. And all of a sudden, I look to my left, and what did I see? Urinals. Oh, the streak is alive. Yes. Oh, I was like, wait a minute. I hadn't walked into their restroom. They had taken over my restroom. And I get it. When I was looking back, I was like, you know what? There are 3 conventions going on. It was a huge conference area. There were no men in their whole wing of the conference. And here comes some dumb idiot running down the hall. Like, I'm going to use the men's room down here. And so they were like, hey, women's room's full. There's probably a line at the time when they came out. And they're like, whatevs, let's just use the women's room too. And they just took over both of them. Oh, it relieved me. That is the most excited I've ever been to see a urinal biscuit in all my life. It's like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that just happened. So here are the takeaways from that story. Number 1, my streak is still alive. I'm still batting 1,000 at that point. Number 2, my streak would end 2 or 3 years later at a Chick-fil-A in Orlando. We'll cover that in another sermon. Number 3, and this is maybe the most significant of the 3 that we can take away from the story, is I think that's a lot of people's view of the church. And what I mean by that is, it was originally intended for men. It was for men, made by men. Like the poster of it is Jesus and the 12 apostles. And, that's what we think. If you don't go any deeper than the poster, you're like, yeah, it's just, it's the dudes. It's like a brotherhood of brosives. It's a fraternity of friars. That's what Christianity is. And so you could get the picture like this is my view of the church. It's made for men, by men. But at some point in recent history, at least in the American church, it's been taken over by women, usurped. That's what some people think. It's like, man, but women have really taken it over. It's been usurped. And to meet the needs of women, it's been taken over. Now it's more of a woman's thing is kind of the cultural feel. That's church, it's for women and children, some people think. But, there's a lot of women who feel like, man, I just don't feel like I really belong here, though. Like, people may think this is something for women or for women and children, but I just don't know that I really belong here. And it still feels like it's for men. A lot of men still lead, and clearly men are the most valued, right? And so anytime a man just might come strutting in and reclaim it and take it over and be like, look, you don't belong here. Look at the sign on the door, man. Like, you don't belong here. This was never intended to be a place for you. And I just want to show you today that there is good news for women. I just want to show you that the church is not a men's restroom, a sentence you thought you'd never hear. The church is not a men's restroom. I admit there's times where it might be a little crappy, but it's not a men's restroom. And so that's the good news today. So Acts chapter 16, we're in a series in the book of Acts, and it's called Good News for All People. And the book of Acts is about the earliest Christianity. It's the birth of the church happens in Acts chapter 2. And then from there, we see Christians begin to go in different directions that we'll call Christian missionaries just because they were taking the good news story about what Jesus did in all different directions and to all kinds of different people. And so the series has been about what are some of the different types of people that were impacted by the good news story that Jesus had come to earth, God in the flesh, to walk among us, but even more importantly, to lay his life down as a sacrifice for our sins and to conquer death in the grave 3 days later. That's the good news of Jesus, and people were just beginning to hear what had happened in Jerusalem with the events of the crucifixion and resurrection. So in Acts 16, we get to verse 11, and it says this. These are about some Christian missionaries here. So, setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace, and the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is the leading city in the district of Macedonia. That's right down the road here. It's like Raising Cane's, chicken fingers, Macedonia. And a Roman colony. We remained in this city some days. So they stayed a while. And on the Sabbath day, which is the Jewish day of rest and worship, we went outside the gate of the city, Philippi, to the riverside, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the women who had come together. One who heard us was a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. He's an apostle, a Christian leader in the early church. And after she was baptized in her household as well, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay." And she prevailed upon us. Now, I want you to notice something that's interesting is in this chapter, Acts 16, this is where all of a sudden Luke, who's the author of the book of Acts, he all of a sudden makes a transition in this chapter in the book of Acts. In Acts 16, he joins them. Luke, the author, joins this team of Paul, Silas, others. He joins the team in Troas, which was mentioned at the beginning of this passage. And it happens in verse 10, which was right the verse before what we read. But he goes from making they, their, them statements in the narration to making we, our, us statements. So Luke, the author, is now a part of this missionary journey, and he's a part of this team. It's this really humble way to say, I met up in Troas. He didn't even say it. You know, he just starts talking about we and our and us. And so Luke is now in this. The author is now in these stories, which is kind of a cool little side note. So let's take a look at this lady named Lydia. So Lydia's story. A few things we learn about her. There's 4. First of all, she was from a city called Thyatira, which was Western Asia Minor. Today it would be Western Turkey. But she lived, so had moved to the city of Philippi, which was a Greek city in a region called Macedonia. They're probably about 250, 300 miles apart as the crow flies, because you kind of got to go around some water to get there. So also, first off, she wasn't born here. She's from Thyatira. So she's kind of cosmopolitan. She's a woman of the world. She's not biased to one particular locale. She's lived in different places, familiar with different cultures. Second thing is she was a dealer. So settle down, not the way you're thinking. Bunch of heathens. So she owned her own business. She was a businesswoman, okay? Third is she was a dealer specifically in purple cloths. Now, that's significant because we know a whole bunch about what that means. So Lydia's hometown, Thyatira, in Asia Minor, was known for producing purple cloth. And for whatever reason, it was very expensive for producing purple cloth, expensive to pay for the process that would dye cloth purple. And so only very wealthy people could afford purple. It was a really big deal. And purple was considered to be very beautiful, and it was also a sign of being rich. You saw someone wearing purple, you knew that they were wealthy. And so therefore, Lydia was a person who sold beautiful clothes to beautiful people. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And so she's essentially in the fashion industry, and she's pretty well off, and she's selling luxury goods. So basically, Lydia today would be like a woman with a high-end boutique who has a shop in downtown Chagrin Falls. You know, like this is a really nice, cute, like ladies love to go there, really nice stuff, a little pricey because it's like upper, you know, it's quality, it's luxury goods. And so this already is good news for women, just because we don't have any evidence, first of all, that Lydia was married, that she was a mom, she was a housewife, she was a homemaker, she played organ at the church. Like none of these things that like sometimes people are like, this is what a Christian woman has to be interested in, has to do, has to have an occupation. You know, like we don't know if she was single or a widow, but she doesn't appear to be married. So she could be younger and single. She could be, you know, a widow and younger or a widow and older. We just don't know. But there's no cookie cutter profile for a godly woman in the Bible of whether you have to have this occupation. You have to have these interests, this marital status, these hobbies, this temperament, this personality, which I know I've heard many times is good news to women in the church who are like, but I'm not sheepish and sweet. I'm kind of more strong and bold. Yeah, godly women come in all shapes and sizes and personalities. And so, in fact, Lydia, she's very much like what's called the wife of noble character in Proverbs 31, who is a wife with children, but is a woman described in Proverbs 31 who is very entrepreneurial, very business savvy. And so Lydia, man, she seems to be ambitious, pioneering, like a total go-getter, maybe a hard charger. So just like she is really just a strong businesswoman. So fourth and final thing is Lydia was not only a sharp businesswoman, but it also says in verse 14 that she was a worshiper of God. Now, that's actually a technical term that I brought up last week. It's talking about being a God-fearer. And a God-fearer was basically a Gentile, a non-Jew, who had converted to Judaism, the Hebrew scriptures and what the Jews, when they worshiped in synagogue. There were Gentiles that did that also and became proselytes. They converted to Judaism. And so she was a God-fearer. And so here we have someone who is just altogether admirable. She's personally self-disciplined, savvy entrepreneur, businesswoman, but she's also a spiritual seeker, a moral woman of high integrity, like just an altogether admirable person. She's a winner. She's a role model. And so the God-fearers often met in local synagogues with the Jews. They would worship with them in the local synagogues. There was the temple in Jerusalem, but then there were these synagogues all over that weren't nearly as formal, didn't nearly have all the rules that the temple did. And so they were kind of like little local churches that were further away from the temple, where there didn't appear to be one in this city, Philippi. There wasn't one. There was one in Thyatira where she grew up, where she was born, but there wasn't one here. And so it appears that on the Sabbath day, the Jewish day of rest, they would get together, the God-fearers that were there in Philippi. They would go outside the city gate, and they would have an open-air meeting outside of the city, and they would pray, it specifically says. They would probably talk about the scriptures, which for us would be the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, and they would have essentially a Mo group by the river. And they would go outside of the city and have Mo group. And the funny thing is we know there is a river about a mile south of Philippi that's called the Gangites River. And so this is what would happen. And in verse 13, it says Luke, the doctor who is the author, Dr. Luke, he's the author. He's like, Paul, Silas, and I, these Christian missionaries, we sat down and spoke to the women who had come together. Now, just right there, the idea that they sat down and spoke to them says this is probably a small group. There's probably not enough people to begin starting a synagogue there, for like the God-fearers and whatever Jews might be in Philippi. There's not. So they were like, hey, let's go out open air. Let's go by the river where we can hear the water, be under the sun, and just go out there and we'll have our group there. So they sat down. It wasn't a big group. It was a big group. They probably would have had to stand up in front of them like would happen in a synagogue typically. And so this probably wouldn't have been a sermon. This probably would have been a give and take discussion, very low pressure, very rational discussion. And that's how the good news of Jesus came to Lydia. Was it a Mo group? I mean, she's sitting there with her friends and the people she worships with, and these guys sit down and have a conversation with them about Jesus because they didn't know about the cross and resurrection, what had happened in Jerusalem. That's why all these missionaries are going out in different directions to tell them what happened. So in verse 14, it says, the Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. Now, that pay attention word's interesting because in different translations, it's always hard to take a Greek or a Hebrew word and sometimes to make it one English word because the languages are so rich. And so pay attention sometimes is respond, but really the idea here is she became attracted to the good news story of Jesus. Like she was attracted to what they were saying. Like, wait a minute, all this stuff that we've been reading in the Hebrew scriptures and learning, all of it points toward, promises, and prophesies this Jesus who just came and did what for us? He died on the cross, he rose from the dead. And so she hears this, she's attracted to the good news. She doesn't just believe it, she begins to find it wonderful. as they're describing how this has all been fulfilled through Jesus. I wonder if during that, from the Hebrew Scriptures, this came to mind as they were talking, where it says in Isaiah 53, which is a prophecy about Jesus in the Old Testament, it said, he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him, but he was pierced for our transgressions. And I wonder, just this idea of here's a woman who, her business is beauty. And she sold beautiful clothes to beautiful people. And she has good taste, good eye for fashion. But she knows about now the Savior who, he had no beauty or majesty. There was nothing physical that would have attracted you to Jesus, is what the prophecies said. He wasn't some good-looking person that people were like, I just want to follow him because he's a handsome, scrapping, well-articulated. That wasn't it. But he was pierced for our transgressions, and she said, now that's beautiful. He died for us. And she was a woman who, her industry was beauty, and she was attracted to the good news. So, I mean, what a great story. Like, she gives her life to Christ right there. She's baptized, probably in that river right next to it. And so what a cool story. So this is a woman who's already winning professionally, and she's doing everything she can, spiritually seeking, and then she hears the rest of the story of what just happened about Jesus, and she gives her life to Jesus, puts faith in Jesus. So 2 things that I want us to learn from Lydia. First is this, please notice the importance of women in the early Christian movement. Please see this. It is throughout the Scripture, but right here, it's so interesting that the Christian church, the radical views of the status and the value of women in a time where that was not mirrored in culture at all. It was very countercultural. I mean, Jesus was an amazing example of showing the value of women, of showing, I value, men are not more valuable to me than women. And so he demonstrated that men and women have equal value as made in the image of God, made in the image of the Creator. And Paul is a follower of that Jesus. And, you will definitely find people who say, man, Paul, he's got a bad rap about women. But I want you to see this example right here. Notice that God's Spirit, at the beginning of this chapter, tells Paul and his team to go to the region of Macedonia. And so he goes to the region of Macedonia. Paul's kind of their leader. And so they go to the biggest city in Macedonia, Philippi. And Philippi's famous. There's famous battles that happen there. And so this is not a small city. It's the biggest city in Macedonia. And so this is the first day that they go into the biggest city of Macedonia. And Paul hears about a prayer meeting. And it's down by the river outside of the city. So he goes there to see what's up. And there's nothing there but women. He walks into this, this outdoor prayer meeting, and it's all women. And what does Paul do? He doesn't say, wait a minute, this is a men's restroom. What do you guys do? Do you see the sign? Get to stepping, get out of here. Come on, he doesn't make all the women go running for the exits. He also doesn't say, oh, there's just women here. Seriously, think about this. In this culture, it's just women here. Women don't have any status in society at that time. They may have had a touch more in Philippi than maybe some other places comparatively, but women don't have much status. So Paul doesn't walk in and say, man, you can't build a church. And that's exactly what we're trying to do in this new city. You can't build a church on women. Okay, let's go somewhere else to find some men. That's not what happens in this situation. He doesn't turn to his, okay, hey, guys, Silas, Luke, let's get out of here. Let's go find some men. Let's hurry before someone here starts knitting or scrapbooking or nursing, okay? That's not what happens. That's not at all what happens. Nope. He sits down and he shares good news for women. He sits down, and the church isn't a men's restroom. I mean, he sits down, he's like, yes, this message is for you. I'm so glad that you're here. And it says, and you notice what Lydia says. She says, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. And she prevailed upon us. So she wants them, okay, you're taking this, you're bringing this message to the city for the first time. This is a brand new thing. So you probably plan to be here for a few days, as it says later. They were there for some time. And so she's like, I want my house to be your ministry center. Like, I want this to be the place where out of this place, maybe you come here for meals, you have a place to know that you can stay here, to stay the night. Let my house be your ministry center, the place where out of this center that you go to serve God and serve others. That's what ministry is. So let this be the ministry center. And we're going to see in verse 40 at the end of the chapter, well, we won't go there, but at the end of verse 40, you'll see the church is meeting in her home by the end of the chapter, after some other things happen in Philippi. And so this is super interesting. The word prevailed right there. She prevailed upon us. It's a really interesting word. Super interesting word, because in the original language, in the Greek, it literally means we had a debate and she won. We had a debate and she went, I want you to stay with us. No, we don't need to stay with you, blah, blah, blah. You don't want to stay with you. We don't want to be a burden. We don't want to oppose. Maybe you're not on the side of town that we most want to be around for whatever. Who knows? But they had a debate about it, and she won. Get this. Paul is an apostle. He's writing books of the Bible. He's an apostle. In fact, I would argue he's the greatest apostle that ever lived. Some would be like, no, you got to say Peter. You got to say Peter was the first pope. No. Paul confronted Peter and told him, you're being racist, Peter. You won't eat with Gentiles. What are you doing? You're giving into peer pressure. So I think Paul is the greatest example of an apostle that we've ever had. He's an apostle, and Lydia's a brand new convert. He's a man. She's a woman. But she wins. He defers to her, and it's like Paul walks out of the restroom and is like, no, wash up, I insist. He's like, this is your place too. We'll take turns, whatever. And so he was an apostle, and he submitted to her, a brand new convert. Maybe the greatest Christian. Jesus wasn't a Christian. He was Jesus. He was the Christ. The greatest Christian who ever lived, and he says, I defer to you. That is Christianity. That is a picture of Christianity. It's Christ-like submission. It's what Jesus talked about, meekness, which means what? Power under control. And it's about submitting to one another. And so that's good news for women. That's good news for everyone in the church. And Lydia becomes a pillar of the first church in that whole area, in that whole region. So when you're reading in the New Testament, and you get to the book called Philippians, short four-chapter little book. People love it because it's like so positive and inspiring and practical, super, super practical. When you get to the book of Philippians, which was written for Christians or the church in Philippi, this city, I just want you to remember every time you read that church largely existed, that Paul was later writing a letter of instruction to encourage him. He seemed to really like the church in Philippi. That church was largely there because of the faith, the mind, the sacrifice, and the leadership and the generosity of an entrepreneurial businesswoman named Lydia. She was like the first beachhead. Her home was the first house church. I mean, in fact, in Philippians 4, at the end of that letter, Paul thanks some women, and he says, they're my co-workers in Christ. They're my co-workers in the gospel, in the good news of getting the word of Jesus out to others. So women were key influences in the early Christian movement, and they still are today. I mean, they absolutely still are today. Like, I love being a part of a church where one of our elders on our elder team at Momentum, a guy named Mike Love, he's down serving in Mo Kids right now with his wife, Lauren. Mike Love has said, I've heard him say on more than one occasion, that one of the people that he identifies with most in the gospel accounts of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the books that talk about the life and teachings of Jesus, one of the people he relates to the most is an unnamed woman who has had a medical issue where she's been bleeding for 12 years. And he says, man, that I think is the person that I relate to in the Gospels the most. Why? Just like, because it says that she had kind of exhausted her resources. She's spending all her money trying to find an answer to her problem, and the answer ends up being Jesus. And he's like, man, that has been my story too, in totally different ways, but that's my story. I was trying to find every other answer I could, and I realized that the healing I needed, what I needed, came through Jesus. And I just love, as silly as that might seem to some of you, I love that one of our elders is like, man, the person I identify with the most is someone in the Gospels who most men would be like, I don't know if I could relate to her at all. Which, by the way, I do want a little caveat, side note. Jesus, when he healed her, it's very interesting. There was a guy named Jairus, a very powerful synagogue leader in a small town that came to Jesus and said, my daughter's sick. She has a fever. Please come heal her. I know you can. He had great faith. Jesus is like, okay, I'll go with you. He starts walking through and crowds start gathering around Jesus. And all of a sudden, this woman that Mike Love says, identify with her so much, reaches out and touches Jesus' garment. And Jesus is like, who touched my garment? And she was like, I just thought if I touched you, you might be able to heal me if I just touched your garment. And he stops this powerful man, rich, powerful man that he's going with to help his daughter. He stops and he's like, like the only person in the world. Read the account, Mark chapter 5. Like she's the only person in the world. And he stops and focuses on her. That is unheard of in this ancient culture. He turns to her and gives full attention to her, so much so that he puts a man on wait, puts him on hold, makes him wait, so much so that his daughter passes away. He's like, okay, I've healed you. Now let's go. People come and say, no, it's too late. She's passed away. Leave the rabbi alone. No, I'm still going to go. And so he goes, and what's cool is Jairus gets more than he asked for. He wanted a cure to a fever, and he got a resurrection. And so even more than he asked for, he's like, you know what? Resurrecting a girl from the dead isn't going to be any harder for the creator of the universe than curing a fever, so I'm going to raise her from the dead. So just an example from Jesus, but Mike says, man, that woman, I relate to her. Man, I've been so inspired and stretched and learned from countless women at Momentum. I had a section where I just kept listing chunks of people at Momentum, but I eventually was like, okay, it's Mother's Day. We got a baby, parent-child dedication to do. We got to, but so many women who have been spiritual sisters to me, or like spiritual mothers to me, or like spiritual grandmothers. I won't name them. I might get hit. But who inside and outside of Momentum, who have just been such an inspiration to me in my faith and the way that they pray, the way that they serve, their boldness of faith, all that stuff. I love that there are many men at Momentum who would say over the years since we started Momentum that they have learned so much about leadership, community, and small groups from my wife, Shannon, who coaches our Mo group leaders. And I love there's so many men that I've heard be like, man, I have learned so much from Shannon about this, or this. Some of these nuances about leadership, some of these nuances about leading a discussion, the way they had a discussion by the river, that kind of stuff. And there's no man or woman on earth who I've learned more about Jesus from than Shannon, personally. Like, women are so valuable in the church. And I love being a part of a church where women are so valued and loved and appreciated, so involved in all this stuff, that I love that my daughter, Aslan, goes here, who's 17. I love that she is seeing a church that values women, that it almost would never come across her mind of like, what? People think that women aren't valuable in a church? I love that my daughter goes to a church like that, where that would actually be a surprise to her. Like, what would that look like? Like, what's that like at your church or churches you've heard of or seen on The Simpsons? You know, whatever it is, like, what does that look like? So notice the importance of women in the early Christian movement and today. And then the second thing, and this is short, is I want you to notice how crucial it is to open your home for ministry. Whether you're a single guy or a married woman, whoever it is, I just want you to notice how important that has been in Christian history. Lydia opened her home, and the rest is history. Like, that's crazy. In the first 300 years of Christianity, there were no church buildings. People either met out in public or they met in people's homes. That's how church happened for the first 300 years. And so now, I know opening your home, it can be hard work. It can be difficult if you're a private person or a super neat person. It can also be expensive. You know, things get broken. I mean, somebody broke our couch once during a Mo group. Things can be expensive. And man, we haven't been using much salt. The salt's all gone. The ketchup's all gone. I mean, it can be expensive to host. Someone drank all the Mountain Dew. I wanted a Mountain Dew. Freaking Mo group, it can be expensive. Just stuff's always running out, disappearing, or whatever. Some of you are like, man, but my house is so small. My apartment, it's just a little hobbit hole. There's a million excuses we can come up with. But Christianity, the world has been changed because Christians have opened up their homes, let people into their apartments. Do you realize the history of the world has been changed by Christians who have opened their homes? I mean, that's the bottom line of it. The Christian movement was based on it. So at Momentum, there are about 110 right now unique adults. Some of them are real unique, but there are 110 unique adults who go to Mo groups throughout the week. And it looks very different than pre-pandemic because most met in homes. Now we have some, thank God, this is a good thing, they're online exclusively, but others that also just don't meet in homes. Some meet at the building, all that stuff. But, I just want you to picture this. I think the number one place for Mo groups should be in a home for a million reasons. But I want you to picture this, that one day we may build an addition over here and a new auditorium and some other kind of space that we need, and we'll turn this half of the building over here. We'll just turn it over to the kids and the students, and it'll be anarchy. We'll just give it to them, okay? But, have an auditorium over there that's bigger, seats a little bit more, all that stuff. But if we were to just build an addition just for classrooms so we could make sure all the Mo groups could meet at the church building, unlike the first 300 years of the church, if we just built it, it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that. We need tons of classrooms. We gotta have all of our Mo groups meet there. So do you realize who's paying for that? Every person who opens their home for a Mo group is absorbing the cost of that so that we don't have to build an addition with an auditorium and all these classrooms that Mo groups could meet in. And so right now, our Mo group hosts, I was shocked to see this actually, just because the pandemic has changed stuff so much. Right now, our Mo group hosts are Krista Tokars, Kim Norris, Jason and Leah Peterson. We have 3 homes. Now, like I said, there's some good news, is it's online also. Like, that's all good. The diversity of how and when is great. But one, I just want to say thank you sincerely to those hosts who are opening their homes, because I think that's a game changer and a difference maker. And I also want to say we need more people to do that. That is always a huge need and a unique way to serve. It's one of the more difficult ways to serve, I think, at Momentum, period. So I want you to know that. But man, we need more people to do that with homes in different communities, close to the church building, far away from the church building, where some people live who are like, that's kind of a drive for me. I live on the west side, all that kind of stuff. But it's more important than to open your homes for Christian ministry and community and fellowship. One thing I want to touch on before I wrap up, Acts 16, there's something fascinating going on in it, is Acts 16, the chapter, is actually 3 wonderful case studies of the gospel impacting different types of people. This is just the first of 3. And the funny thing is it's the first one is Lydia, who's a savvy businesswoman, God-fearing woman. The second is a fortune-telling, demon-possessed slave girl. Couldn't be more different of a female than Lydia is, and she's the second case study. She's just a kid. She's probably 10 to 14 years old. She's economically oppressed and exploited by her slave owners who have her tell fortunes for money. And she's spiritually oppressed. She's a slave to inner demons. So if Lydia is the owner of like a high-end boutique in Chagrin Falls, then very frankly, you read the story, and I think you'd probably agree, she's kind of like a drug-addicted prostitute who's being exploited by a pimp and lives in a drug house. I mean, she has no power at all in her life. And she's the second. And then the third is actually preached on this last year, is a Philippian jailer, probably an ex-Roman soldier who's a jailer. He's a Gentile man. And so, Philippi was a Greek city, so he's in this Greek city, probably an ex-Roman soldier. So there are 3 examples of the good news of Jesus changing lives, 3 totally different types of people. And now, if you were here 2 weeks ago, I purposefully planted this 2 weeks ago to come back to it today. Ancient Jewish men woke up in the morning and they prayed this prayer. For those of you who are here, this is a reminder. The prayer was, "O Lord, I thank you that you didn't make me a woman, a slave, or a Gentile." Acts 16. Lydia, slave girl, Roman soldier, Philippian jailer. Isn't that fascinating? All 3 of the case studies in Acts 16. That's it. Now, Jewish men woke up. You can look this up online. You'll see people fighting about it and all that kind of stuff. Just because, what? That's so offensive. Yeah, it's kind of offensive. It's kind of offensive. Yeah, I'm a Gentile. Yeah, I'm offensive by it. Yeah, some of you are like, I'm a woman and I'm a Gentile, or whatever. So it's like, that is offensive. But think about this. Paul, before Acts chapter 9, He wasn't a Christian. He probably prayed this as a Jewish Pharisee every morning when he got up in the morning. Then what happened? Jesus changes his life, and now a woman, a slave, and a Gentile are now family to him after Acts 16. They become the pillars of a church in Philippi. They become some of the first members of the church in Philippi, and it's basically the outline of Acts chapter 16. And so Paul plants a church in Philippi where 3 members of his launch team are a woman, a slave, and a Gentile. Like, how awesome is our God that happens? That Paul goes from, thank God I'm not, to now, man, you guys are family. You guys are family. What kind of power could change people like that to bring them together? And I think the point of this entire chapter is simply this. It doesn't matter who you are. You need Jesus. He created you. He knows how you work. He knows what you need. It doesn't matter. No matter what your needs are, Jesus can meet them. This is good news for all people. Jesus is for everyone. Jesus was beautiful enough for Lydia. He was powerful enough for the slave girl that was possessed by demons, and he was practical enough for the Philippian jailer. And so the church isn't a men's room. The church needs strongly both the feminine spirit and the masculine spirit, both of those. And so there just isn't a Christian type. And maybe that's the summary of Acts 16. You know, you might look at your friends, your coworkers, people around you, people in your family, and you might say, yeah, there's conservative types, there's liberal types, there's the cultured types, there's the cultured types, and then there's the hot mess types. You might admit you're maybe a hot mess type. And so, but think about it, what's the Christian type? Read Acts 16, and then you tell me what's the Christian type. There is no Christian type. There isn't any. Christianity is so true that it is rich enough, it's flexible enough, it's versatile enough for anybody. And it can change anybody. Man, I implore you, surrender to Jesus. Put your faith in Christ. Be baptized into Christ the way that Lydia was, and let Jesus meet your needs.